Broadcasting from the campus of Linn-Benton Community College, we are the Mid-Valley STEM-CTE Hub. I'm your host, Casey, and this is Closing the Gap. It's good to finally meet you, though. It's pretty awesome to have a class with somebody and get a lot out of it, and then finally, in the online way, be able to finally meet you in person. So I thought it was really impactful.
Oh, I'm so happy to hear that, Casey. Good. It's a little tricky online because you just don't ever know.
I think that for this first episode of season 5, I wanted to really demystify feminism, and I hear all these things like, I'm not a feminist because I don't hate men, or I have never felt oppression, I'm not treated unequally, I'm not a lesbian, I can't be a feminist because of that. And it just leads me to believe that there's not a lot of understanding around what feminism is. And I would like to ask you if you could give us kind of an overview of what feminism actually is and what the movement is all about.
Thanks for this super important question, Casey. So people have a lot of big feelings and about buzzwords, and I typically find that it ends up being about the connotations that words carry more than it is about the underlying values that people hold. I'm a big fan, as you will remember, of Bell Hooks and her definition that surrounds this. Her definition is that feminism is a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. Very rarely do I encounter people who are advocating for sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression, though they're out there, and some of them are currently in power too. But when we can look, if you ask people back, well, give me a good definition. What does feminism mean? To people that are saying, I can't do this, I can't do that, you'll often sit and actively listen, and people will struggle to answer that question and realize, and then it's about psychology. Are you going to get defensive because you heard the F word, feminism being the harder word to say, or are you going to realize that, maybe you need to do a little learning around this idea and this topic. But, at the heart of the feminist project today, I would say it's about working towards ending oppression, which is a really big topic that involves a lot. And, changing people's minds and hearts to be open to being different in the world is really tricky, but it's also possible, especially with learning and education. So,
for sure, yeah, it seems like there's a lot of binary. If I identify as this means that I have to feel a certain way, or if I think women deserve more rights, it means that men don't get as many rights, but that's not really the case.
Right. And oftentimes I see that there's a misunderstanding of what power is. When all people and men, understand that power is not a pizza pie where we're going to run out of slices, and that their relationships with all people will improve, then I think that everybody can really benefit from a deeper understanding of what power is and competition to begin with. So
for sure. So who is feminism for exactly? Can men be feminists? Can cis straight women be feminists? It seems to be a misconception that in order to be a feminist, you have to hate men. Can we talk about men's role in feminism as well?
Yes, this is so important too. So when I said the F word as feminism there, this has systematically been a slander campaign against that. And it's traced in film studies, it's traced in media studies and gender studies to show that throughout the 80s and 90s, there's been a systematic attempt to dismantle and what feminism means, and to put it together and co-opt it into some type of feminazi was a terrible word that people had said at the time, and that it was about men hating all things. Mm-hmm. Humans are socialized from birth to accept sexist thoughts and actions, and as a consequence, women can be just as sexist as men, just as men are hurt by patriarchy. Mm-hmm. It's a system of oppression, as we just talked about. So, by design, patriarchy as a system of oppression does not uplift people's needs for safety or a sense of belonging, self-expression, different definitions of freedom. So when men take a stand against patriarchy, which they are the group who benefits the most, though it continues to hurt them, mm-hmm. That's when culture rapidly changes. For sure. We're taught to be, like I just mentioned, in constant competition with one another, but we're sitting here living in abundance, mm-hmm. and we're manufacturing the politics of scarcity over and over. So it's really not about who the boundaries and over-identifications of identities, perhaps, but more about, can we think about figuring out how to live together and be together, and in doing so, realize that sharing power is going to uplift everybody. So yes, men are essential to feminist movement. Some of the best feminists I know are men and identify as such. Yeah.
That's awesome. And not to just kind of go back on your points of over categorizing people's identities, but I appreciated that you also mentioned how other women can play a role in holding others down or perpetuating patriarchy and those kinds of ideals. Because it makes me think of, you're in middle school and you're getting bullied for being like the girl is not wearing makeup or doesn't have the right shoes or, whatever it is. And I just think it's like a great idea to maybe be conscious of like what you're actually doing.
Yeah. And honestly, that middle school is a great example because that's when you're starting to internalize a male gaze, mm-hmm. and have two young girls talking about makeup or looking a certain way. The male doesn't even need to be in the room for two young girls to be tearing each other down. But it's still embedded in this larger system of oppression, which is patriarchy. Having, I keep saying girls because you mentioned middle school, but people need to uplift others, especially those that are kind of pushed to the side of our power structures. Yeah.
What I was thinking of next is like, why does it matter? But it seems like, because I mean, if you look at it, you could look at the history really and be like, oh, well, this has already happened. We look at first, second, third wave feminism, and in the history books, it's like, oh, it's a past thing. We don't need to. But from what you're saying, it's clearly still present and happening every day.
I haven't seen power be erased from the human inner workings of society. So as long as that is here, which is really what humans have gotten up to in much of history as well, but we're still operating in that. One of the fastest ways to create a situation where power is present goes back to manufacturing scarcity, whether that's in budgets for higher education or education budgets for the state. There's a ton of scarcity that's put onto people, and then in those environments, humans will, try to do their best to maximize what they can do with their possibilities. But knowing that these are systems that we're creating and they're not necessarily real in the first place, I think is important too.
For sure. And I think this is a little bit off script, I guess, but the scarcity mindset, it has me thinking of, there's people that are still living today. Lots of people are still living today that as young women, they weren't able to buy things themselves. They weren't able to have their own credit cards. They weren't able to have their own bank accounts with like the approval of a husband or a father. Do you think some of this scarcity mindset is kind of bred into us because it came out of survivalism for women?
That's a really good question. I think that the scarcity is really more about the necessity of the economic system that we've manufactured right now and what we're living in. I do think that there's been an over feminization of poverty. So yes, I think that if you look at who's poor, you'll see that women globally are, not just locally, are more affected that way. So there's going to be more of a grappling there for sure. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, I think that's one of the topics that I remember the most when we covered in your class. And besides like just the wage gap which I think is like an obvious topic when we talk about feminism and like women kind of getting some sort of like financial independence and prosperity, but also how they're not necessarily thought of as like an heir to the family's wealth in terms of like cash or land. And those are like things that like over the long term are what really change lives, is that kind of that inheritance of money, that being able to invest into a family for generations and generations. And yeah,
absolutely. Feminism, I think, is an intergenerational project, and young women and gender minorities in particular understand that it is a intergenerational project. But to think of that as something that has been achieved, like this is over, we just have to close the wage gap, but we're good, is a really, really grave issue for young women specifically to think about. I mean, the perspective of saying, like, while it is true that my mother, for example, when she was born, was not able to have her own bank account, and that I didn't have access to maternity leave policies, and I'm in my 40s now. These things are true. So these are really important milestones to think about. But to think that, I think one of the things that is insidious, there's a few things, for young women specifically, to think that feminism is something that has been part of the past. Like we needed it only when you weren't allowed to wear pants or didn't have access to a bank account. Still don't have access to maternity leave. So that's and there's wage gaps. So there's still things to think about here. But it's kind of akin to saying that one doesn't have to vote or participate in democracy because it's, well, here.
Yeah.
Right? And there are countless examples, both historically and contemporarily, that will tell us and teach us that democracy can and will disappear without public participation. Rights can be taken away often much quicker than the struggle to gain them. In Iran, pre- and post-revolution could be a really easy example to illuminate this, but there's countless examples here. So I think generally people, young women in particular, should really think about knowing that there's not an inevitable arc of progress. There's a false notion in history where we think we're advancing towards a better future, but a better future is going to really be about people's actions today.
For sure. How do you think this misunderstanding or this misconception that it's not a thing that's still affecting women today, how does that happen?
I don't think young women in traditional age college students are thinking too much about maternity policies not being accessible to them, for example, or the wage gap of their future careers. I think that this is one of the painful experiences that people go through when they're living it, and when we don't explicitly teach these things, then we'll continue to make the same problems, because by the time somebody gets to their wage gap and they're in the thick of it, they're too busy to think about what the next step is and how they're going to change things, even though they may, hopefully. But I think that gender studies in general needs to be explicitly taught to people.
It seems like it's a prime example of that adage, if we don't read the history books, it's bound to repeat itself. Yeah. It's seems a little, I don't mean to like put that idea down, but it seems a little bleak, you know, because how do we, it seems like young people, they're so preoccupied with like just being young people and living their lives, and how do you get someone serious about something that doesn't really affect them? I mean, I think you can see young people like trying to figure it out and live their lives, and not necessarily maybe knowing the steps or the things that they should do to get it right for their future selves. Kind of wonder how, I don't know, how we make them more accessible or more something that they're driving to figure out for themselves ahead of time.
Yeah, it's a good question. Casey, I think it's really about understanding the lived experiences of people and being exposed to stories. I know that young people actually do quite a bit of reading. The reading just looks a little different than, me and my stack of dusty books all the time. So I think that there's ways that we can address this, and through the mediums that people are working with. But I think it's also something that we have to, everybody needs to be exposed to stories of women of color, of gender minorities, of the diversity that makes the workplace better, that makes science better. And without these stories, we are unable to see past our own selves. So I think that the basis of a liberal arts education needs to be upheld in our society, and not subject to the politics of scarcity with budget regimes and funding that often happens to that type of education.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. I appreciate that you just said that. So I think another big thing that I took away is that, and we kind of touched on it earlier, feminism doesn't have to be a one-size-all philosophy or way of life or thinking. It can change from subculture to subculture and region to region. Can you kind of touch on why that we don't have to maybe think about it as just one thing?
This is such an important point. It's, as an anthropologist, I can't help but go back to this idea of culture. And culture is the backbone of what makes us human. It's not going to go anywhere. And so when we create these one-size-fits-all, which is very much part of white women's suffrage, for example, from the 1920s, when white women gained access to the vote, it's still celebrated as women's access to the vote. But at the time, the Voting Rights Act for black women didn't become franchised until 1965. Native American women, when white women gained the vote, were not yet citizens of their own continent. So when we think about these past mistakes that white feminists brought to the table with their enormous class privilege and ability to write history in a certain way, I think that in that white feminists really spent a good amount of time denouncing cultural practices, and that these cultural practices can sometimes be incredibly harmful. It's okay to have a perception of this is what constitutes human rights and we need to uphold them. But it's also okay to use an understanding of cultural relativism to understand what rights people want for themselves as well, and to make space for culture. So feminism will never be able to continue to be the global movement that it is without people's making space for their cultural practices. And it's going to be complicated with what to do with cultural practices that hurt young women, like inheritance patterns in land usage, or for a lot of Western feminists have been very into this idea of female genital cutting and what that might mean for human rights. And I think it's important for Western feminists to continue to focus on important issues, but it's also going to be important to think about how we're operating the usage of law and policy that is happening in Los Angeles and Chicago and New York, because that's where female genital cutting, for example, happens as well. This is not Egypt's problem or some faraway issue. So I think back to that one-size-fits-all policy, and this idea is really a white policy from the past, from the first wave. The second wave of feminism, if we talk about it in waves, was an enormous amount of class privilege that left a lot of people out of that conversation. We still see this, though. We still see talking about glass ceilings. They can be relevant in some, but very few contexts of women's lives around the world. In India, women are often fighting for the right to privacy while urinating, for example. This movement's called the right to pee. In Gaza, women are fighting for their and their children's very lives at the moment. So, when the former chief operating officer or COO of Facebook or Meta, Sheryl Sandberg, tells women to lean in their book. This is older now, it's 2013, but this kind of thinking is important in the workplace for women to go ask for raises, for example, or apply to jobs that they don't meet every single possible criteria for. But we're also reaching very few people globally when we do that. And so it still goes back to that old class privilege that is part of the one-size-fits-all feminist past. So I think it's important to at least acknowledge that when it's happening and go ask for a raise.
100%, yeah. I've been listening to a lot of women talk about finances lately, and so I definitely appreciate that you had brought up the asking for a raise and talking about apply for the job even if you're not 100% qualified or something, based on the LinkedIn job description. But I also think it's important that we talk about how it's great that we do those things, but also some people are just still fighting for basic rights. I didn't know that people were fighting for the right to urinate in private. It seems like such a thing that I'm so far removed from that I guess, I could see how, people aren't even thinking about that and thinking about how do I get a leg up economically. But it's also important to forget that it is also not important. Nope. It's also important to not forget that we're not all sharing the same lived experience. And if we are not recognizing that, how we're not seeing each other's humanity in different cultures.
Absolutely. And in the right to pee movement in India, for example, is just one example. More people on the planet have access to their screen, their cell phone, than they do to a modern toilet. So this is not to paint a picture of India in any way. It's to explain just what constitutes the now on the planet is actually quite diverse as it is. So someone might not have access to a toilet while they also have access to Instagram at the same time.
It's so fascinating to think about.
Yeah.
Wow. I think that also, it makes me think about why diversity in workplaces is very important. Why, because I imagine someone that comes from maybe the U.S. is going to have a different perspective of maybe that person in India if they were to be working together on a similar project. They could bring different perspectives, different ideas, different thoughts, different ways of looking at it. So does feminism play a role in the workplace?
Absolutely. Feminism is such a critical thing to think about in the workplace, and because we actively create cultures. They're micro, little tiny ones, right? Like this building we're in right now. But every workplace is going to, be its own local culture. So it has to be created with intention, or else it will just create itself. And when we're not intentional. So again, as an anthropologist, I can't help but speak about cultures in general. And I would tell you the only constant in any culture is change, right? So if everything's in motion and everything's in change, then, working on utilizing one's own agency of how they want to be, how they want to live, how they want to show up in the world is going to be essential. Now, the workplace, will change rapidly as well. The way that culture changes can be something as small as refusing to laugh at a sexist joke. When you do that, you're telling the typical, you can be looked at like, oh, lighten up. Like that's also part of patriarchy right there. By telling you like, it's okay for me to have this type of conversation at the copy machine in the morning. But when you refuse to, your patriarchy then in your workplace shifts. It's mediated. It's you're creating a space in a workplace and it's shrinking because you just suck the oxygen out of it. So I think this is how you create local cultures of classrooms, of workplaces. And you have to really actively listen to the people there and what they want. And actively listening is so critical. I mean, it's everything. It's ensuring that the voices in the room that have been historically silenced are actually being centered, heard, acted on, and part of creating the diversity that will allow a workplace to flourish. Because when people aren't written into the sense of belonging in a space, then they will not show up in their work the way that a good leader would want them to.
So what I'm hearing is that we can do all the work to get the numbers right, but we won't actually maybe see any change on like the institutional level unless we are actively working to evolve our minds and how we think about things.
Absolutely. And in doing so, there are systematic barriers that can be removed for people to allow the diversity of a workplace to be ensured. The first person in Congress to give birth was Tammy Duckworth just a few years ago, and there was no policy in place. We had never had a birthing person be so young in Congress at the time. And Tammy Duckworth is also a veteran and disabled veteran, and gave birth while being in Congress, and they had to figure out how to allow a baby on the floor so she was able to participate and vote. They ended up saying that that baby was not allowed on the floor of Congress, and that they had to create a childcare in the lobby for her to go vote, since children were not allowed in the room at the time. And, these are the systematic barriers that need to be explored, but they're not going to be without listening to the people in the room in the first place.
For sure. Have they since changed their mind?
They have changed their mind since then. There's not enough historical precedent that this was just a few years ago.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I think that's so interesting because it really speaks to a very common problem in society of like, there's a lot of single mothers, or there's a lot of families that, need more money coming in. So what do you do with the kid?
Yeah.
Like childcare in our country is insane, and is in comparison to like the cost of living, or like the amount that people are getting paid a lot of times. And
absolutely. One of the biggest obstacles that the United States faces is that the lack of safety net that this country has created over time, and lots of politics, you can trace the lack of the safety net coming from tax fights from the Civil War era. You know, it's still the same conversation in different ways. The U.S. relies on women to fill in those gaps. So that's really tricky to flourish in a high-paying career at the same time when you're having to be the country's safety net. So that's a feminist issue in a big way, and it's one that affects men just as much.
Definitely.
Families. It's really something to not have the ability to pay for childcare and it's really setting up the next generation to perpetuate the same cycle of, grappling for resources at the same time.
Sure, yeah. It seems like an endless struggle then,
Mm-hmm.
What can people do if they want to be good feminists or good allies? I don't know if you could be an ally without then being a feminist too, but I don't know, like, could you give listeners that are like really vibing with this idea some examples of how they could just show up and be better about helping create space?
Yeah, I think that it's necessary to, again, come back to understanding how can I show up and learn something new about somebody today that I'm sharing a space with? What does that look like? What does it look like to have a colleague or a coworker, or that you have never really learned something about? What happens before work? What happens after work? What is going on with the 70 text messages from the babysitter who's sick, and what does that mean for that person in that moment? In trying to accomplish a task. It can be something as small as, hey, do you need to leave a half hour early? Because we can get this done later. Or if you're in a workplace that's obsessed with productivity and efficiency, like most workplaces have as their orienting principle, then you can think about, well, what makes people productive? And how do you create a sense of belonging where people want to work hard? People love working hard. We're really good at working hard as humans. We don't really create the path of least resistance with culture. I like to say that's the realm of physics, but it doesn't really apply necessarily with culture. So if you really wanted people to to work hard, you would create spaces for them to be able to do so. It's really not rocket science that way.
Sure. Yeah.
But being a good feminist means uplifting the people in your local environment, and also thinking much more globally than just beyond just yourself at the same time. It sounds simple. Sometimes I think that we tend to simplify things that we should really complicate. Like ideas of gender are actually quite complicated. And when we simplify them, it's problematic. But then when it comes to figuring out how to create policies and spaces, we often will complicate things that can actually be pretty simple at the same time.
I was thinking about that as you were kind of giving your examples of how we, could create like a more productive workplace by making people feel comfortable and included and understood. And I think it's great that we have like these talking points, and I'm also like, well, how does someone start doing that? And I guess maybe that's not necessarily the job of a podcast, but really looking inside yourself and being like, how is it going to really hurt us or benefit us to offer daycare in the lobby, or let someone work from home if they need to for a day, or our deadlines really all they're cracked up to be.
Yeah, I think that it's necessary for people to confront what's going on inside of them, and to create we do this with educational spaces very well, and workplaces are similar. What does it mean to confront the enemy within before you go and confront that outside of you? And that's from bell hooks, not me. So I have to say that. So the enemy within is that internalization of patriarchy, of sexist thinking. And so in order to say, well, why would it bother me if there was a child on the floor of Congress? I don't think that would impede the voting process. It would impede the rituals of authority that have served those in power for many, many years. But what might that disrupt? And asking those questions, I think. So when tensions arise in classrooms, in workplaces, in families, wherever, really looking into the general question of, well, why is this upsetting people in the first place? What is it about that inside of you that makes you so upset to think that there might be a child on the floor of Congress today? And I think just that pause of introspection, it can really create a lot of change.
Yeah. And it seems like our culture doesn't really allow for a whole lot of pause.
No, we don't like pauses so much. We've actually gotten so much to the point where I've asked students who are, 25 years younger than me, usually, not all the time, which is nice. I love non-traditional age students. They get so much out of anthropology and gender studies.
For sure.
Yeah. And usually rock the classes, I will say, too. So I also see that there's this, and I don't live in this world because of my own age being different, but students will say things like, and I'll ask them, go to a coffee shop, sit at the table, get a cup of coffee, and sit there. Not with a phone, and just sit there. Or sit on a bench outdoors with nothing in your hands and notice a leaf, maybe some wind, a bird. What does society think of you? And they all say that they're creepy. Everybody sees them as just creepy. So when you're not busy right now in 2024, you're creepy. And I think this is something workplaces need to address as well, because it's really okay to notice a bird on a park bench without looking busy on your phone. And so there's a real performative piece. Nobody's as busy as they say they are right now, although time has been crunched and there's more time poverty right now than there has been in a while. Not the most, but historically, but in a while. But yeah, I think that whole principle of how you are and how you show up in the world and think about even time, space, and place, and intentionally bring yourself to those concepts are going to create better workplaces.
For sure. Not to cut off the end of your idea, but I'm just sitting here thinking that creepy was the last word I was expecting to hear come out of your mouth.
Yeah, it's surprising to me too, because I don't share that.
Yeah. I personally, I wish that I had some better skills in unplugging and just sitting on a park bench, because I really like the park by my house, and I would love to just be able to take it in sometimes without being like, did someone email me?
Yep. Maybe you can try this weekend to see how long you can physically make yourself sit there without a phone. It's not easy. We can do it with a book. We're still, but just to sit, I think in an age of distraction, we're also distracting ourselves from our emotions, and they're not going anywhere. They're just coming up in a different way.
100%.
So, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. That's just so profound to me. It makes me think of what I did over my lunch break yesterday, and how, you go do these things to escape yourself, and then somehow you still find yourself, even though you're doing the things and you're being distracted or trying to be.
I think that understanding and leaning into very safe levels of discomfort all the time is very, very important for resilience and understanding how we can grow and then continue to feel on this long life project which is very much a feminist project of how to sit in your own self, how to sit in your own body, how to just be. And I think that the ways that people are going to come up with that can be incredibly creative and unique. But yeah, definitely learning to sit and be bored for just a whopping 10 minutes is going to be pretty profound. And maybe that 10 minutes becomes 12 and maybe a whole hour over a summer or something.
For sure.
Yeah.
So besides being present, which I thought was a really good piece of advice that you gave before, do you have any other pieces of advice for young women and gender minorities that are looking to get into the workforce here soon? Because it's kind of a scary place sometimes.
Yeah. I think workplaces need to understand that when they invest in women and gender minorities, that paycheck and that money directly goes to the next generation. And, there's a lot of issues with microfinance and loans, but there's a reason they give loans to women as well, because children have more calories that aren't when they need them when money is loaned to women, for example. So to think about so my advice, okay, I'm actually good at giving advice, but I tend to try to not give it to anybody unless they asked. Okay, you asked. Free advice is so annoying. So I would tell young women and gender minorities that you not only belong, but that you also make science better, that you make the workplace better, and that you need to do your best to grapple with safe levels of discomfort in order to continuously grow, and that you need to prop up other women and other gender minorities as well all the time. And, to talk about science briefly, science is the backbone of my education and my livelihood as an anthropologist too. And it also is about Western culture's dominance and hierarchy and power. And that's more often than not really crappy science, but having more diversity in the workplace, in science, is going to make it way better and more rigorous. And less about all of the baggage that comes along with it. So when that, not only, like I said, not only do you belong, but we need you there. We need science to continue to be more rigorous in its methods. There's a really old study now, but it's because it's from 1991.
Oh, don't say that.
I know I said it. But I think that this can be replicated too, and should be. Maybe I should do it. So Emily Martin, she passed away because the study's old. But she was a phenomenal anthropologist, and she did a linguistic analysis of research labs on the egg and the sperm. And if you just Google Emily Martin, egg and sperm, the first link will be a PDF to this reading. What she found was that there was so much bias going on in the science concerning assigning gender roles to an egg and gender roles to a sperm, which is funny at best, that the researchers themselves had not considered the culture of their workplace in what they were studying in the first place. So we actually only learned a good amount of how an egg decides to be fertilized. It is not a passive role. It is a very active endeavor.
Oh, that's interesting.
And just the passivity of the language that has surrounded this, because we've assigned an object a gender role that is historically created and not even necessarily lived today, it really gets in the way of research, and it really gets in the way of findings. And not unsurprisingly, women were not, and gender minorities were not in those labs when this was being done. So this is an old study, but it's still an important one to think about too. And my advice would be to let women and gender minorities know that they really are needed and their perspective is needed. And so to not just belonging, but which is very, very important, but they are desperately needed for the process of education too. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, I like that. And I hesitate to continue because I feel like that's such a great way to leave this this podcast. Though I just want to kind of validate and double down on that idea because it makes me think of how medical research, a lot of things we knew about the human body or we thought we knew about women's bodies were studies that got information from men's bodies, or just looking at just diversity on a whole. We could look at like what AI has been fed and the kinds of things it spits out, and then typically what kind of people are feeding it that information, and how that correlates. But
absolutely, yeah. There's so much to talk about.
There is so much to talk about, and we're wrapping up here. We're closing in on a whole hour, so I wanted to thank you for coming on, and this was a really great chat, and I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did.
Thank you so much, Casey.
Thanks for listening to Closing the Gap. This podcast is a production of the Mid-Valley STEM-CTE Hub. If you would like to be part of the conversation, fill out our interest form at midvalleystem.org/closingthegap. If you like the show, follow us on Spotify to stay up to date with the newest episodes. And for STEM news in the Mid-Willamette Valley, follow the Mid-Valley STEM-CTE Hub on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn.